Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be working on the tabletop for this cabinet. Now normally when you make a cabinet, the tabletop is nothing super special, but because I like making stuff a little overdone, I decided I'm going to do a breadboard end tabletop for this cabinet. So just something that'll make it look a little bit cooler on the top, which is an area you're going to be seeing a lot. So I've got this beautiful wide board here. You can see that it's about 9.5 inches wide, just over a little over that, which is going to be perfect for getting the full width of our top out of 2 pieces from here. Now, normally when you make a top, you make it out of an odd number of pieces. That way it's just more visually interesting. But I think it's going to look really nice just having these 2 pieces right beside each other. We have very straight grains on either side. So when we join it up the middle, that seam should be pretty much invisible. And so I'm really excited to break this piece down into the 2 separate pieces and then go from there. And so the first problem we're going to come across is the fact that I do not have a jointer wide enough to flatten these boards. Obviously, if you guys have watched my channel, you've seen that I only have a 6-inch jointer. Now, luckily for me, I have found many ways to work around that small 6-inch size, either by cutting stock smaller, or in this case, with when I want to keep boards nice and wide like this, I go to a router sled, which is just a nice simple flattening jig, which we'll cover in just a second here. So I'm really excited to do this. As soon as I went and picked up these boards, you guys probably saw it in the milling video, that a lot of the boards that I picked up afterwards, after we did that initial milling phase, a lot of the ones I picked up were nice wide boards, and this was one of the widest ones, and I knew I picked this one specifically for the tabletop because I wanted to be able to fold it in half, basically, and make our tabletop. Alright, so our router flattening jig is all set up and ready to go now. So we've got our board firmly held in place with some blocks just held down with some double stick tape. We've got a nice 2-inch slab flattening bit in our 2.3 horsepower router. Now, what's really important here is a couple things. First off, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you have a variable speed router. This is the Bosch MRP 23, something like that. And it has variable speed. So we're going to be going down to speed 3 on here. So not the slowest it can go because this isn't that big of a bit, but you want to make sure that you can slow it down. Some routers, especially the Porter cable routers, which is what I started with, they can't be slowed down. So you don't want to be spinning a big 2-inch bit at that full speed. So make sure that you have a variable speed router. Second, for a very accurate base of for this jig, all you need to do is go to Home Depot, Lowe's, wherever, pick up a 3/4 inch sheet of MDF, take a couple strips off the outer edges. You want to make sure to keep those factory edges as intact as possible. Then all you're going to do is rip them to an equal width on the table saw. Then you just tack them onto either side, and that'll give you your proper reference depth. Now, I built this jig specifically for 8/4 stock. This jig goes all the way back, if you look at my channel, all the way back to the hickory and walnut bedroom bench that I built probably close to a year ago now. So this jig has been around for a while and it's done well. I'll probably rebuild it to something a little bit nicer that has a few more features here and there, but this has held up really well. The actual router sled here is just made with some Baltic birch plywood. It doesn't really matter what you use here. You could use MDF. I just found that I just had a piece of plywood lying around. Same thing, the runners on the side are hickory, and again, didn't really matter what wood it was. Just thought it was a nice hardwood that would be firm enough to keep the plywood from warping. And so what you want to make sure when you're making the router sled part of this is that when you put on these runners, you're going with the grain sideways here. So you can see these are 4/4 pieces of wood laying on their side and then attached to the Baltic birch plywood on the bottom. So that way these will completely prevent this sled from dipping or warping over time because they are screwed in really well. Another nice feature here is you want to make sure to put in some kind of stops. You can see on the side there's just some pieces of wood just stapled to the bottom of the slide here. And that way, when I'm pushing back and forth, I can't accidentally pull the sled off of the tracks here. Because when you've got the router running, you want to make sure that literally nothing can go wrong, because this bit can do a lot of damage to both you, your piece of wood, and your shop in general if something goes really wrong. So make sure everything's nice and secure, and yeah, build things properly. Alright, so now our boards have one perfectly flat face that we can reference against the bottom of our planer to then get these to a proper thickness. Now, if you don't have a planer, if you're just a really small shop or you're just getting started, you can actually go through the whole thicknessing and material processing phase with just that router sled and a table saw and get very accurate square stock. Because now that you have one accurate flat face, all you have to do is flip it over and just slowly work your router down till you reach the same thickness on all your pieces. So you can actually use a router sled for all of your milling needs, well, combined with a table saw to do some edge ripping as long as you have like a tapering jig. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but yeah, it's a very easy way to get nice flat boards. And so now all we're going to do is flip our boards over, take them over to the planer, get this other side perfectly thickness down to 3/4 of an inch, because that's what we're going to be making our pieces to. And so what we want to make sure of is when we're doing the planing step, all 4 of these pieces are getting planed to the exact same thickness using the same settings of the planer at the same time. Again, it's just for accuracy's sake and making sure that later on we don't have a lot of cleanup work to do after ourselves, and we come out with a nice flat breadboarded end tabletop. So it's just a very accurate way of working. So we're going to get these through the jointer. Then once we have everything cleaned up on the planer, we'll go back in and we're going to edge joint one edge on all of these, and then go to the table saw and yada yada yada. Again, if you guys watch the milling video, the very first one in this series, you'll have a pretty good idea of the steps involved in this. All right, so the beard magically disappeared along with a lot of the hair is gone. I'm recording this video the same time I'm recording the glue up video, so that's why you'll see kind of the beard change at the same moment in the videos here. And so before we do the glue up here, I wanted to quickly stop and talk about why we're doing breadboard ends on this tabletop here. And simply enough, it's just because it looks really cool in my opinion. I just love the look of the breadboard ends. I think it just creates a more complete looking tabletop. Now you could definitely finish this thing with just, a nice simple flat panel, and I think it would look just as good. But breadboard ends to me just look extra good. So the way this is going to work is we have 2 pieces of wood, so I wanted to do a tenon per wood. Now typically when you do breadboard ends, you're supposed to do a minimum of 3 tenons because you want to be able to pin the middle ones and allow the outer 2 to move. But because we have 2 pieces of wood here, I'm just going to kind of go for it and see what happens because I'm not expecting a whole lot of wood movement in between these. Now, what I'm going to do here to prevent this panel from ripping itself apart is I'm only actually going to glue the front tenon in, and I'm just going to loosely pin the back tenon. This will still allow the same wood movement as a normal breadboard end would allow. Alright, so our last step here is to attach the tabletop to the cupboard itself. Now, we're not actually going to be attaching it in this video, but I want to save that till the very, very end because there's still a lot of stuff I have to do to this. Attaching the cupboard doors, I'm going to have to turn this thing on its side a few times to mount our hinges. It's a lot easier to get the drawers in and out if there's not a tabletop on here. All that stuff is just going to be a lot easier without having the top on there, so I'm going to wait to do it. But what we're going to be using to actually attach the tabletop is these figure 8 fasteners. Now all these it's a figure 8 shape with 2 holes on either side, nicely countersunk, and what these allow for is a lot of wood movement. Again, because we're working with real wood and that panel is quite large, we want to allow for a lot of wood movement in it, and these make it so that the piece is not permanently affixed to the cupboard. It's allowed to move and rotate with the season as this piece moves and rotates on the screws. So these figure 8 fasteners are probably my favorite option for attaching tabletops to bases like this. But you also have a lot of other options out there. There are Z-clips, which are basically you cut a little groove on the inside of your stretchers, and they sit in that groove, and then you screw them to the top. They're a very similar idea to this, but I haven't been able to find an easy way to work with them because you do have to be able to cut a groove on the inside. The only way to really easily do that is with like a domino joiner because I don't want to put a full groove on the table saw going through there, so they're not as efficient for me. These guys, on the other hand, are very efficient. And so the other option would be to go very traditional with it. If you want to see how to traditionally mount a tabletop to a base, you can check out my video where I made the walnut and hickory bedroom bench. That was a traditional way of mounting a tabletop to a base. Alright guys, so I just got the second coat of oil on this. Still gotta wait a while until we can wipe it off. That's why it looks so shiny the way it is right now. It's not gonna be this shiny once it cures and once we actually get it mounted. Alright, so let's quickly talk about the tabletop here. So there's a few different design things that went into this, most specifically the walnut dowels. Now you guys might be wondering why there's 2 dowels per tenon. And the main reason for this was a glorious mistake on my part. Again, like you guys explained in the one video where we were finishing up the cupboard and I had that extra hole in there, I mismeasured on one of these holes as well. It seems to be a common mistake for me, and again, the best way to prevent doing that is to not use a tape measure wherever possible. If I'd used something like this combination square and actually set it to the dimension in from the outer edge that I wanted, I wouldn't have made the mistake I did here. And so what I ended up doing is all the main holes that I was supposed to be cutting into were supposed to be 6 5/8 from the outside edge. And so what did I end up doing on one of them? I went 5 5/8 because I don't know why. I just misread or something, or I just got confused. Who knows? It happens from time to time. And so I didn't pay attention close enough, and so I ended up drilling that hole. And so rather than trying to plug that like I did on the actual cupboard itself, on that one extra hole that I accidentally cut, you can't really get away with that on a tabletop because it's a very clear and open area. You can see all the little imperfections on it. And so I just decided to go in and add an extra dowel in all the tenons. Now again, the important thing here is because this is breadboard ends, because these are genuine breadboard ends, I had to make sure to go in and widen up all the holes. So the only dowels that are tightly holding into the tenons are these 2 on the front edge here. Those are the only ones that are perfectly fit into the holes. The other 4 on each, or the other 3 on each side are all in widened holes. So I really should have shown this better on camera, but I was kind of stressed out and freaking out about the fact that I now had to drill all these extra holes in it. But now that I actually have it sitting here, I think it really does the piece justice. I think it just adds that little bit of extra detail. And so the reality of it is this is one of the biggest things you have to figure out as a woodworker is how to accept your mistakes and work them into your piece. Because, normally this would have, 2 to 3 dowels per end on it, and that would be normal. But this looks just a little bit different. I quite like the way it looks, so it's just visually kind of interesting. And the dowels do, in some way, help our breadboard ends. It's just more holding points, holding those tenons in. So it is kind of a benefit, but it's also just mainly a visual thing that it all looks good now. And so what I really love about this thing is the fact that I was able to get such a wide piece and then put 2 of that piece beside each other to get this full tabletop just looks so good. The grain matches seamlessly into the middle. We've got a nice amount of cathedral right in the center of both of these boards that line up nicely with our dowels on the end. It all just works super well in my opinion. Our breadboard ends are a little bit of a different shade of white oak than our middle piece, which in some ways I think is really cool because it just shows different wood colors in that, and it just makes them, it creates a little bit more separation. Now, if you don't like that color difference, really all you have to do is get a little bit longer piece of wood than I did, and make sure you cut your breadboard end pieces from the same piece as your main body piece. And so visually, I do like the color difference between our breadboard ends and the main body of this thing, but if you don't like that, again, it's not a complex thing to figure out. And so also I didn't show on camera sanding this thing. Because of the breadboard ends, I don't like hand planing or scraping tabletops with breadboard ends. Because what ends up happening is you have to be very careful about where you put your plane in. You have to basically go at a 45-degree angle through the piece. Again, this is not, I don't really know how you hand plane tables like this with breadboard ends. Because if you go straight across, you end up tearing out the grain on the sides. If you try and go at a 45, you kind of tear out the grain on both areas. So really the best way I've found is to sand these things. Anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The next one, we're going to be working on the cupboard doors here. And I came up with a really cool design with them. Again, it was one of those things where I made a big mistake, then I had to figure out a way to fix it, and it actually came out really cool in the long run. So I have them sitting beside me here, so I don't want to spoil them, but yeah, they do look really cool. They're not finished yet, and I'm still working on them right now, but yeah, they look cool, and I think you guys are going to love them. So I do hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.